I deal in white oak, Douglas fir, and mortise and tenon joints. Wood doesn't lie to you. If you cut a tenon too short, the joint wobbles. If you don't seal the end grain, the weather finds its way in and rots the heart of the timber from the inside out. It's a clean profession. You get cold, you get dirty, but at the end of the day, you can look at a frame and know exactly why it's standing. That was why I stayed in the valley when the construction boom started 3 years ago. While other contractors were busy throwing up vinyl-sided subdivision houses with prefabricated trusses and cheap drywall, I kept my 3-man crew small and my workshop busy with timber restoration. It didn't make me rich, but it kept the truck running and my mind quiet. Then came the second week of October. A late-season nor'easter rolled over the ridge, bringing 3 days of freezing rain that turned the valley clay into a thick gray soup. The temperature hovered just above freezing, the kind of wet cold that gets under your skin and stays there until spring. I was in my shop oiling a set of framing chisels when the landline on my workbench rang. The voice on the other end was dry, tight, and completely focused. "Is this Sam Miller?" "It is," I said, setting the oiled rag down. "My name is Hannah Cole. I run the Cole Heritage Orchard on the North Slope. My main storage barn just dropped its ridgepole. Half the roof is in the dirt, and my entire Spitzenberg harvest is sitting in crates under the exposed joists. I need a builder who actually knows how to work with their hands, not a salesman with a clipboard." I knew the Cole orchard. Her father, Arthur Cole, had been one of the last old-school orchardists in the county, keeping 40 acres of heirloom apple varieties alive when every other farm was converting to commercial red delicious or selling out to developers. Arthur had suffered a stroke the previous winter, leaving the entire operation to his daughter. The local gossip was that she wouldn't last the season. The bank was hovering. Her labor budget was non-existent, and Douglas Vance, a local real estate developer who had already turned the southern pasture into a half-finished strip mall, was waiting for her to default. "How bad is the collapse?" I asked. "The west sill plate failed," she said. No panic in her voice, just the cold calculation of someone who had already spent the morning measuring the disaster. "The rafter ties on the north side sheared. The main bents are still standing, but they're leaning 12 degrees off plumb. If the wind shifts to the east tonight, the rest of the structure is going into the creek. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. I didn't call my crew. They were hourly, and I wasn't going to drag them out into a freezing downpour until I knew if there was even a frame left to save. I threw my heavy jacks, 3 come-alongs, a dozen ratchet straps, and my vintage slick chisel into the back of my F250 and drove north. The road up the slope was already washing out. Water ran in brown sheets across the gravel, carrying gravel and dead leaves down into the ditches. When I pulled through the stone gates of the Cole farm, the scale of the disaster was clear. The barn was a classic mid-19th century bank barn, built with hand-hewn hemlock timbers. The west section of the roof had folded inward like a broken cardboard box. Through the splintered rafters, I could see stacks of wooden crates, each filled with dark red, hand-picked apples. Standing in the mud at the edge of the ruin was Hannah Cole. She wore a yellow oilskin slicker that looked 3 sizes too big, likely her father's, and a pair of mud-caked muck boots. Her dark hair was tucked under a wool cap, soaked through around the edges. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an engineer studying a bridge failure. She had a yellow legal pad in one hand, protected by a clear plastic zip bag, and a pencil in the other. I parked, climbed out of the truck, and let the cold rain hit my face. The wind was coming hard from the north, whistling through the fractured hemlock of the barn. "You're Sam," she said, not waiting for me to introduce myself. She didn't offer a hand. Both of hers were wet and smeared with old grease. "I am," I said, walking toward the leaning corner of the structure. And you're stubborn if you're standing this close to a frame that's 12 degrees out of plumb. The apples are underneath, she said simply. If I lose the Spitzenbergs, I can't pay the property tax on the South Orchard in November. If I don't pay the tax, Douglas Vance buys the tax lien from the county. So I stay close. I stepped under the dripping eave of the intact section, my boots sinking 4 inches into the saturated clay. I looked up. The joinery was beautiful. Classic mortise and tenon, secured with white oak pegs. A century of water runoff from the driveway had rotted the white oak sill plate on the west wall. When the wet snow from the previous night put 20 tons of weight on the roof, the rotted wood simply compressed, dropping the wall and causing a chain reaction failure through the rafters. The frame is salvageable, I said, tracing the split on a primary post. But the roof is done. We need to shore up the leaning bents, clear the broken rafters, and build a temporary shed roof over your crates before the temperature drops tonight. If those apples freeze, they're only good for cider vinegar. How much? She asked. She looked at me directly. Her eyes were a sharp, clear gray, surrounded by the pale, lined skin of someone who slept 4 hours a night and spent the other 20 working. For my crew and me to shore it up, it's a 3-day job. Usually that's $4,000 in labor plus materials. Hannah's jaw set, her grip on the yellow notepad tightened. I have $1,100 in the farm account and 300 bushels of the best heirloom apples in the state. I don't eat 300 bushels of apples, Miss Cole, I said quietly. I'm not asking you to, she replied, her voice dropping an octave, steady and hard. I'm asking you to trade. You use hemlock and white oak for your frames. My father kept a 10-acre stand of virgin white oak on the ridge. It hasn't been logged in 80 years. It's tight-grained, slow-growth timber, the kind you can't buy at a yard for any price. I'll give you timber rights to 10 trees of your choice if you help me save this harvest. I looked from her to the leaning barn, then up toward the ridge where the dark, ancient silhouettes of the oaks stood against the gray sky. It was a fair trade. In fact, it was a generous one. A single slow-growth white oak log, straight and clear of knots, was worth more to my shop than 3 months of residential trim work. You know what those trees are worth? I asked. I know exactly what they're worth, she said, but they don't pay taxes unless they're cut, and I don't have the equipment to log them. You do. Do we have a deal, Sam? I looked at the yellow pad in her hand. She had already drawn a rough diagram of the lean, calculating the weight distribution of the remaining rafters. She hadn't asked for pity. She hadn't tried to use her situation to get a discount. She had made a cold, professional offer under a freezing rain. Let me get my jacks, I said. The first 2 hours were brute force and geometry. I backed my truck as close as I dared, the tires churning the gray mud into deep ruts. I unloaded 2 12-ton hydraulic bottle jacks, 4 heavy screw jacks, and my collection of timber framing straps. You're not going to wait for your crew? Hannah asked, lifting a heavy timber framing strap out of my truck bed. Without being asked, she threw it over her shoulder like she'd been carrying rigging gear her whole life. They're working on a dry porch project down in the valley, I said, hauling a 20-foot hemlock 6x6 post toward the leaning corner. By the time I call them and they drive up here, the wind will have shifted. We do the shoring now. Just you and me. Tell me where to stand, she said. We worked in a rhythm that usually takes weeks to build with a new apprentice. Hannah didn't ask useless questions. She watched how I set the footings, using heavy white oak blocks to distribute the weight of the jacks on the soft mud, and copied it on the opposite side. When I needed to plumb the post, she held the level against the rough-sawn timber, her hand steady despite the cold rain dripping off the brim of her cap. Up on the jack, I called out, my hands slick with rain and grease as I adjusted the screw level. She leaned into the iron lever of the hydraulic jack, using her body weight to pump the cylinder. Slowly, with a deep, wet groan that sounded like a living thing shifting in its sleep, the massive hemlock post of the barn began to rise. The ancient mortise joints creaked, shedding flakes of dried mud and old whitewash onto our shoulders. "Hold it there," I said, checking the plumb. "Don't move." I crawled underneath the leaning sill, my shoulder pressed against the wet, cold clay. With a 6-pound sledge and a timber drift pin, I drove a new temporary hemlock block under the post to take the weight off the jack. The steel hammer hit the pin with a dull, heavy clank that echoed through the empty barn. When I crawled out, my face was smeared with gray mud, and my jacket was soaked through to the thermal lining. Hannah was still holding the jack lever, her face pale with effort, a thin line of sweat cutting through the dirt on her cheek. "You can let go now," I said. She released the valve. The jack hissed, and the barn settled onto the temporary block. It didn't drop. It stood straight, plumbed to within half an inch. Hannah let out a long, slow breath, her shoulders dropping. She looked at the plumb bob hanging from the ridgepole, then back at me. "That's one," she said. "3 more to go," I replied, "but the wind is dropping. We have an hour before the temperature hits 32. We were working on the 3rd post when the sound of a modern diesel engine broke through the constant rush of the rain. A clean, silver GMC Sierra pulled into the muddy yard, its headlights cutting through the gray dusk. The tires barely slipped on the gravel as it parked near my old Ford. The door opened and Douglas Vance stepped out. He wore a dark blue Gore-Tex jacket, clean leather boots, and a matching cap with the logo of his development company. He didn't step into the mud. He stayed on the gravel path, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking at the collapsed roof with an expression that was far too close to a smile. "Hannah," he called out, his voice raised over the wind. "I saw the roof from the state road. I told your father 3 years ago that hemlock doesn't last forever." Hannah didn't drop her wrench. She didn't even turn around until she had finished tightening the collar on the ratchet strap we had run across the center bent. When she finally turned, her voice was cold enough to freeze the puddles. "The hemlock is fine, Douglas. It's the water runoff from your new access road that rotted my sill plate. We'll be discussing that at the next township conservation meeting." Vance chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. He looked at me, taking in my mud-covered coveralls, my old truck and the heavy jacks. "You're Miller, right? The guy who still uses wooden pegs?" Vance asked. "You're wasting your time. This frame is dry rotted from the plate to the purlins. It's a liability. The county inspector is already scheduled to come out on Friday to look at the structural safety of the agricultural buildings on this slope." Sturge. "The frame is slow-growth hemlock, Mr. Vance," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "It has 3 times the shear strength of the pine dimensional lumber you're using to build those cardboard townhouses down the road. It's not going anywhere." Vance's eyes narrowed, the polite developer persona slipping for a fraction of a second. "It's a hazard. If this roof falls on someone, the liability will clear out whatever equity is left. In this place, Hannah, my offer stands until Thursday night. I'll buy the south 30 acres for $40,000. It clears your back taxes and leaves you enough to move Arthur into a proper care facility in town. After Friday, when the county condemns this barn, the value drops by half." "The barn won't be condemned," Hannah said, her voice completely flat, "because by Friday, the roof will be cleared and the structure will be certified by a licensed timber engineer." She looked at me. I hadn't agreed to certify anything. I was a builder, not an engineer, but I didn't blink. "Friday morning," I said to Vance. "We'll have the stamps ready." Vance looked at the 2 of us, standing in the mud under a half-collapsed roof, looking like 2 shipwreck survivors arguing with the ocean. He shook his head, turned, and climbed back into his clean truck. The silver Sierra backed out of the driveway, its red taillights disappearing into the rainy dark. He's right about one thing, Hannah said after the sound of his engine faded. If the inspector condemns the barn, the bank calls the mortgage on the orchard. They have a cross-collateralization clause on the land and the buildings. Then we don't let him condemn it, I said. Where's your tractor? In the machine shed. It's an old Massey Ferguson 135. It starts most of the time. Go get it, I said. We have a lot of hemlock to move before morning. The next 12 hours were a blur of cold grease, diesel exhaust, and the sharp, clean smell of freshly split hemlock. Hannah's tractor was small, but it had a heavy-duty front head loader that her father had modified with steel teeth. While I used my chainsaw to cut the collapsed, splintered rafters away from the main bents, Hannah used the loader to drag the wreckage out into the center of the yard. We didn't talk. The noise of the chainsaw and the tractor engine made conversation impossible anyway. We communicated with hand signals, 2 fingers up for lift, a flat palm for stop, a thumbs up when a timber cleared the frame. By midnight, the rain had turned into a dry, biting sleet that stung our faces and turned the mud into a stiff, crunchy crust. My hands were so cold I could barely feel the trigger on the saw, and my back felt like it had been beaten with a timber mallet, but the debris was cleared. The Spitzenberg apple crates sat in neat, dry stacks under the remaining, shored-up section of the roof, covered by 3 layers of heavy canvas tarps we had secured with cedar battens. We stopped when the Massey Ferguson's fuel gauge hit empty. Hannah shut down the engine. The sudden silence of the farm was immense, broken only by the steady, dry clicking of the sleet against the tarps. She climbed down from the metal seat, her movements stiff and slow. When her boots hit the ground, her knees gave way for a second, and she had to catch herself on the tractor's rear tire. Inside, I said, my voice hoarse from the exhaust and the cold now. She didn't argue. The farmhouse was a small, white clapboard building, sitting 50 yards up the hill from the barn. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old wood, beeswax, and dried lavender. In the living room, an old cast-iron wood stove was radiating a dry, sleepy heat. Hannah pointed to the kitchen. Bathrooms down the hall. Dry clothes in the closet near the door. My father's old flannels. They'll be short in the sleeves for you, but they're dry. Thanks, I said. 10 minutes later, I was sitting on a wooden bench by the stove, wearing a faded red plaid flannel shirt that smelled of cedar shavings and cedar wood. My wet gear was hanging over a drying rack near the door, steam rising slowly from the heavy wool. Hannah came out of the kitchen carrying 2 blue ceramic mugs. She had changed into a dry gray fleece and wool socks. Her hair was damp, brushed back from her face. Without the mud and the oversized slicker, she looked younger, but her shoulders still had that tight, defensive set. She handed me a mug. It was hot apple cider, thick and dark, spiced with cloves and ginger. My father's recipe, she said, sitting on the opposite end of the bench. She held her own mug with both hands, letting the steam hit her face. He used to say that if you drink enough of this, you can't feel the winter. I took a sip. The heat went straight to my chest, cutting through the cold knot that had settled there during the 8 hours of chainsaw work. He was right. Thanks for staying, Sam, she said quietly. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the orange light of the fire through the glass door of the stove. Most people would have seen the mud and the bank notice on the door and driven back to town. I told you, I said. I don't like vinyl siding, and I really don't like Douglas Vance. She let out a soft, tired laugh. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it changed her face entirely, softening the hard lines around her mouth. Vance has been trying to buy this ridge since my father was in the hospital. War. He offered to build a senior living village here. He wanted to call it the Orchards. He didn't see the irony of cutting down 40 acres of heirloom trees to build a place named after them. He's a developer, I said. They don't deal in ironies. They deal in square footage. My father planted some of these trees when he was 12 years old, she said, her voice dropping thick with a quiet, fierce protectiveness. The Spitzenbergs, under the tarp. Thomas Jefferson grew them at Monticello. They're difficult trees. They get canker. They're susceptible to fire blight. And they only produce a full crop every 2 years. But the fruit. If you taste a Spitzenberg in November, you realize that every modern apple you buy in a grocery store is just sweet water wrapped in red wax. You can't let something like that die just because some bank in Chicago wants a quicker return on investment. I watched her. Her fingers were red and calloused from the work, the nails short and clean now. She was 28, maybe 30, and she was carrying the weight of a century-old farm on her own back because she believed that some things were worth the work. "We'll build a monitor roof," I said. She looked up, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "What? A monitor roof?" I repeated, leaning back against the pine paneling of the wall. "It's a classic three-tier barn roof. We can use the existing bents as the center span. We raise the center section 6 feet, put in transom windows for ventilation, and slope the side roofs down over the bays. It uses less heavy timber than a full reconstruction, but it's twice as strong against snow loads. And it looks right on a bank barn." "Can we do it with the white oak on the ridge?" she asked. "If we log it this week," I said. "My shop has a portable band sawmill. We can cut the timbers right in the yard." "We don't have time to season it, but green oak is fine for a timber frame if you bore the mortises. The wood shrinks around the pegs as it dries, locking the joints together forever. It's how they built the cathedrals in Europe." Hannah stared at me for a long moment, her expression shifting from calculation to something that looked very close to hope. "You're serious?" "I don't joke about white oak," I said. She smiled, then a real wide smile that showed a small chip in one of her front teeth. "Okay, Sam, tomorrow morning we go to the ridge." By Wednesday, the storm had moved out, leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it looked like polished glass. The air was sharp, smelling of wet earth and frost. My crew, 2 young guys named Caleb and Toby, showed up at 7 with my flatbed truck and the logging chains. They were timber framers, not loggers, but like most guys in the valley, they knew how to drop a tree without killing themselves. We rode up to the ridge in the back of my truck, the tires crunching over the frozen ground. The white oak stand was spectacular. The trees were massive, their trunks gray and deeply furrowed, their branches reaching wide over the undergrowth. These weren't the fast-growing scrub oaks you find in old pastures. These were old-growth forest trees, tight-grained and heavy. Hannah walked with us, a yellow ribbon in her hand. She didn't choose the biggest trees. She chose the ones that were crowding each other, the ones that needed to be harvested so the younger oaks underneath could get light. She understood forestry the same way she understood orchards, not as a resource to be stripped, but as a system to be managed. "This one," she said, tapping a straight, 30-inch diameter white oak that rose 40 feet before the first branch. I took my chainsaw, checked the oil, and pulled the cord. The engine roared, breaking the silence of the ridge. I made the undercut a clean 45-degree wedge on the downhill side, then walked around for the back cut. Hannah didn't walk back to the truck. She stood 20 yards away, her hands in her pockets, watching the saw cut through the wood. The tree didn't fall fast. It leaned slowly, then gathered speed, its branches whistling through the cold air before it hit the forest floor with a dull, heavy thud that shook the ground under our boots. The smell of fresh, sweet oak sap rose immediately, sharp and clean. "That's one," Caleb called out, starting his saw to limber the trunk. We spent the day on the ridge. By 4 in the afternoon, we had 6 massive logs loaded onto the flatbed, their heavy ends secured with logistics chains. When we got back to the yard, I set up my portable band mill near the barn. The mill is a simple machine, a 20-horsepower engine that drives a thin bandsaw blade along a steel track. But in the hands of someone who knows how to read the grain, it can turn a rough log into a perfectly square timber in 10 minutes. Hannah didn't go inside to make dinner. She put on a pair of leather work gloves and took the tail end of the mill, catching the heavy white oak boards as they came off the blade and stacking them with pine stickers in between to let the air circulate. "You don't have to do this," I said, stopping the engine to adjust the water drip that lubricates the blade. "My guys can handle the stacking." "My farm," she said, her voice muffled by a dust mask. "My timber. Beside, Toby is stacking like he's playing Jenga. The airflow is wrong on that third pile." Toby, who was 19 and had a habit of looking at his phone every 20 minutes, blushed and adjusted his stacking. By Thursday night, the yard looked like a busy timber yard. The framing bents were laid out on sawn hemlock blocks, their mortises cleared with my heavy, slick chisel and mallet. The timber framing process is a quiet one compared to modern construction. There are no nail guns, no circular saws screaming through plywood. Just the steady, rhythmic clack-clack of a wooden mallet hitting a chisel and the long, curling shavings of green oak falling into the mud. Hannah worked with a draw knife, peeling the bark off the hemlock rafters we had salvaged. She was fast, her movements smooth and economical. "You've used one of these before," I said, walking over to check her progress. "My father rebuilt the tool shed when I was 12, she said, not stopping. Her shoulders worked in a steady, rolling rhythm, the draw knife pulling a 3-foot ribbon of bark off the log with a dry shk sound. He told me that if I learned how to use a draw knife, I'd never have to buy a replacement handle for anything. "Your father was a smart man," I said. "He was stubborn," she said. She stopped, leaning her forearms on the hemlock log, looking toward the farmhouse where a single yellow light was shining in the kitchen window. "He still is. He's sitting in that rehabilitation room in town, refusing to do his physical therapy because he says the nurses don't know how to make proper tea. But he asks about the orchard every day. I haven't told him about the barn." "Why not?" He'd try to climb out the window and walk back up the mountain," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "He thinks he's still 30 and capable of lifting a ridgepole on his own." "We'll have the frame up tomorrow, Hannah," I said. "You can tell him then." She looked at me, her gray eyes serious under her dark cap. "We have 16 hours before the inspector gets here, Sam, and we still have to raise the rafters." "The bents are framed," I said. "The joinery is tight. We'll raise them at dawn." At 6:30 Friday morning, the air was cold enough to turn our breath into thick white plumes. The valley below us was completely filled with a soft white fog that looked like a lake of milk. Only the tops of the ridges stood out, dark and green against a pale orange sky. My crew was there, along with 2 other local builders I had called in for the raising. Timber framing is one of the few construction methods that still requires a community. You can frame a modern house with 2 guys and a nail gun, but you cannot raise a 3-story timber bent without 5 or 6 people working in perfect coordination. We used my truck's heavy-duty winch, run through a snatch block secured to a large maple tree behind the barn, to do the heavy lifting. "Everyone on their pike poles," I called out, my hand on the winch controller. Hannah stood at the base of the center post, holding a heavy white oak peg and a framing hammer. Her job was to drive the peg home the moment the mortise met the tenon. "Up easy," I said. The winch cable tightened, humming under the strain. The massive center bent. 3 tons of fresh white oak and hemlock began to rise from the mud. It rose slowly, its heavy legs pivoting on the iron pins we had driven into the concrete foundation footings. "Hold it there," I shouted as the frame reached 45 degrees. "Pike poles in." Caleb and the other builders jammed their long pine poles against the rising timber, bracing their boots against the frozen ground to keep the frame from swinging. "Up more," I said. The bent came plumb. The tenons of the crossbeams slipped into the mortises of the standing posts with a deep, satisfying thunk that we could feel through our boot soles. "Peg it!" I yelled. Hannah didn't hesitate. She stepped into the frame, her hands steady as she lined up the white oak peg with the pre-drilled hole. She swung the framing hammer, 2 clean heavy blows that rang out like gunshots in the cold morning air. The peg slid home, locking the joint. "Clear!" she called out. We raised the remaining 2 bents in under 2 hours. By 9 o'clock, the skeleton of the new monitor roof stood tall against the sky, its raw, white oak timbers shining like silver in the morning sun. It was 10 minutes past 9 when Douglas Vance's Silver Sierra pulled into the yard, followed closely by a white Ford Escape with the county emblem on the door. A thin, middle-aged man in a yellow hard hat and a safety vest climbed out of the Ford. He carried a clipboard and a heavy digital camera. Vance stepped out of his truck, looking confident. He had a file folder in his hand. He walked toward the barn, his eyes scanning the yard for the wreckage he expected to see. He stopped 10 yards from the barn. The frame was standing. It wasn't leaning. It was perfectly plumb, the new white oak bents rising 15 feet higher than the old roofline, creating a beautiful, clean structure that looked like it had been designed by a master architect. My crew was already up on the staging, nailing down the new hemlock roof decking with steady, rhythmic hammer blows. "What is this?" Vance demanded, his voice tight. The inspector, a man named Mr. Henderson, walked up to the frame. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at the joints. He reached out, running his hand over the fresh white oak of the center post, then looked up at the mortise and tenon connections. "Is this green oak?" Henderson asked, his voice curious. "Green white oak," I said, stepping down from the timber pile. "Drawboard with 2-inch pegs." The sill plate is new pressure-treated fir, bolted to the concrete footings with 1-inch anchor bolts. Henderson took his glasses off, wiped them on his tie, and put them back on. He walked around the entire structure, checking the plumb with a pocket level and tapping the timbers with his pen. "The frame is engineered?" he asked. I handed him a roll of blueprints. I had spent 4 hours on Wednesday night drawing them up, using my structural drafting software, and had them stamped by a licensed civil engineer in town who owed me a favor. 3-span timber frame, I said, designed for a 70-pound snow load and 90-mile-per-hour wind shears. It meets the historical agricultural exemption under Section 403 of the County Building Code. Henderson looked at the blueprints, then at the frame, then back at me. He let out a slow whistle. "Beautiful work, Miller. You don't see joinery like this anymore. Most people just use pole barn tin." "The owner wants it to last another century," I said, looking at Hannah. Hannah stood by the tractor, her face clean of mud, but her boots still caked in clay. She didn't say a word. She just watched the inspector with that same quiet focus she'd had since the storm started. Vance stepped forward, his face red. "Henderson." The west sill was dry-rotted. The structure was collapsing. "I have photos. The rotted sill has been removed." "Mr. Vance," Henderson said, his voice flat. He took his official stamp out of his pocket, breathed on it, and pressed it onto the yellow county permit sheet on his clipboard. "The building is structurally sound. In fact, it's probably the strongest agricultural frame in the county right now. I'm signing off on the emergency repair permit." He handed the yellow sheet to Hannah. "Good luck with the harvest, Miss Cole," Henderson said. "My wife buys your Spitzenbergs every year. They make the best pies in the state." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said. The inspector climbed back into his white Escape and backed out of the yard. Vance stood on the gravel path for a long moment. He looked at the standing barn, then at Hannah, then down at the file folder in his hand. He didn't say anything. The developer's confidence had evaporated, leaving behind only the tight, frustrated look of a businessman who had lost a prime piece of land to a couple of people with hammers and some old wood. He climbed back into his truck, and drove away, his tires kicking up gravel as he went. "He'll be back," Hannah said as the sound of his Sierra faded. "He'll find another way. The property taxes are still due in November." "The apples are safe under the tarps," I said, walking over to her. "And you have 300 bushels of them. Let's get them loaded into the barn." We spent the rest of Friday sheeting the roof. By sunset, the new hemlock boards were down, covered by a heavy, waterproof underlayment that would keep the snow out until we could get the metal roofing on next week. My crew left at 5, their trucks rattling down the hill toward the highway. The yard was quiet again. The smell of fresh sawdust and pine resin was thick in the cold air. The first stars were appearing over the ridge, bright and cold against a deep purple sky. Hannah and I stood inside the new barn. The room was immense now, the high monitor roof creating a cathedral-like space that felt clean and secure. The apple crates were stacked neatly in the center, their dark red skins catching the yellow light of my work lamp. "I have something for you," she said. She walked over to the corner of the barn and brought back a small wooden box. It was old, made of cherry wood, with a brass latch that had turned green with age. She opened it. Inside were 6 small glass vials, each filled with seeds, and an old, leather-bound notebook with the initials A.C. embossed on the cover. "My grandfather's orchard logs," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He kept notes on every tree he planted from 1920 to 1965, and these are the seeds from the original Spitzenberg parent trees he brought from Virginia. They're 30 years old, but they've been stored in beeswax. If we plant them in the nursery next spring, we can start a new block." She looked up at me. "I want you to help me plant them, Sam." And I looked at the old notebook, then at the woman standing in front of me. The cold wind was whistling through the transom windows of the new roof, but inside the barn it was warm and dry. "I'm a builder, Hannah," I said quietly. "I don't know much about growing trees." "You know how to build a foundation," she said, her gray eyes steady and clear. "And you know how to work with your hands. That's all the trees need." I reached out, my fingers touching hers as I took the box. Her hand was warm, the skin rough and calloused from the week's work. "We'll need to prepare the soil this winter," I said. She smiled, that small, chip-toothed smile that had become the most familiar thing in the valley to me. "I'll make the cider," she said. We stood there in the quiet of the new barn, surrounded by the smell of green wood and winter apples. For the first time in years, the valley didn't feel like a place that was being paved over by progress. It felt like a place where the roots went deep and where the things we built with our hands would stand long after the storms had passed.